Come now, all you mangy dogs. Swab the decks and hoist the sails. The guns on board be needing some proper manning. Pieces of 8 and a fine wench on your arm. If your work be not too shoddy. Careful not to flounder too badly, though, or you may have to dance the hempen jig as we see you to Davy Jones. Jeffy, my boy, on with the show.
Welcome, everybody, to episode 145 of Pirate Radio Podcasts. I'm your host, as always, the Robin Hood's Chief Communications Officer, Jfk Ryder. This week, we have a return guest, someone who may be familiar, more than familiar, to our regular listeners, Robert Morningstar. We have his biography here on hand as well, too. So I'm just going to take a look at that and give you a bit of a rundown if those out there in the audience are not familiar with his backstory. But in a nutshell, Robert's a civilian intelligence analyst and New York City-based psychotherapist, an expert in Chinese language, history, and martial arts. He received a degree in psychology from Fordham University and is an FAA licensed pilot and instrument ground instructor with 25 years of flying experience. It's been a while now since we last talked to Robert, so we have a lot of catching up to do. From JFK to the world of ufology, all things Trump and more. The conversation could very well lead us off in almost any direction. And that's pretty much what we had discussed just in the pre-show. We were running a bit of a last-minute audio and tech check. Robert, there's a few areas you like to take the conversation this week. JFK, ufology, the current state of politics in the U.S. One of the items that we had in mind, though, as well, from a strictly pirate angle, was your father's naval history. But before we even get into that, maybe if you think I missed out on anything as far as your background or bio is concerned, there's bound to be a few listeners out there, people dropping in and joining us this week who maybe aren't all that familiar with your stories. Is there anything more you'd like to add to things, just to round off or flesh out the details?
Well, basically, I think what people need to know is I was basically raised in New York, educated in New York, from grammar school through college. I went to what is now a legendary high school called Powell Memorial Academy, where I was in for 4 years, and I happened to go to school with Kareem Jabbar when his name was Lou Alcindor. And then I went to Fordham University, where I got my degree in psychology in the pursuit of parapsychology. And during that period of time, I volunteered for a U.S. Navy-sponsored, I should say, Office of Naval Intelligence and IBM-sponsored research project into artificial intelligence. And as a result of my participation in that experiment, I found that over the years that the experiment itself boosted my own IQ significantly. And I've used that boost, what I like to call the Krell brain boost from the movie Forbidden Planet, which is where I think they got the idea for this kind of testing. I think it also, in retrospect, I think it was also the basis or the early research into mind reading machines. But that's another aspect that we don't have to get into too deeply. But I've used that artificial intelligence experience and faculty, which I feel I now have, to unravel many of the mysteries that have plagued our society, like the JFK assassination. Oh, the series of assassinations that kept redirecting our history from the course that that we had been following. You have to admit that nothing deviated America from her course in history than more than the JFK assassination, which steered us right into Vietnam, which he was trying to avoid. Then, when Martin Luther King started to develop and amalgamate the power of the civil rights movement and move politically, he was assassinated. And then thirdly, of course, is the assassination of Robert Kennedy. And these are triplets. These assassinations, they're all interrelated, and they all had the effect of keeping America on the wrong track of history. And I dedicated a large part of my life to redirecting America back onto the right track of history. And I've done that through my JFK research, exposing the worst, most diabolical example of mind control is the Zapruder film combined with the Warren Commission report. These two instruments of deception created a schism in reality in America, and we're seeing the effects of it today. America is split between two forms of consciousness, and I believe that these two forms of consciousness, which are at war with each other, intellectually as well as socially and civically, were the result of cognitive dissonance that was imposed on the American public, where they tried to force us to believe that Oswald had acted alone in the interest of communism to slay President Kennedy as a lone assassin. And what came out of that were two types of American people, two types which don't see eye to eye on anything, because there was a large majority that was convinced by propaganda and MK Ultra mind control that fake reality was true. And then there were the rest of us who couldn't be sucked into that belief system, who still saw reality as it was, stark and terrible and horrible, and the implications of what the JFK assassination meant for the nation. So many chose to become munchkins and follow the Wizard of Oz. And the Wizard of Oz was led by the mass media, moguls, working in concert with Lyndon Johnson and the hawks in Congress to draw us into the Vietnam War, to propel the military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower had so nobly tried to warn us against on his last night in office, his last speech, which I saw as a boy. That in a nutshell is what I think people should know about me. There's a lot of other things, ramifications, offshoots of the initial work. For example, I remember discussing the JFK assassination and UFOs with my cousin Mark Whitford, who lives in Washington. And he said that he was going to write up something. This is 1993. He was going to write up something about me and UFOs. And I said to him, no, don't you dare do that. You might smear me. That might smear me in my work on the JFK assassination. So I was really, really concerned to keep these two fields of research separate and apart and not associated in the public mind with my name, but simultaneously. Yet I've been studying UFOs since 1956. I saw Major Kehoe when he was on CBS twice with Mike Wallace, and another one was the Alcoa Theater. And on one of them, when he started to speak the truth, they shut off his mic, and he kept talking even louder, and they backed the camera away from a close-up, but you could hear him yelling across the studio about the message he was trying to get across. So I've been into UFOs a very long time. My brother was an abductee in 1962. That's how long I've been studying alien abduction, because I was the one that drew it out of my brother. He had been terribly traumatized and had clammed up, and I, took him aside as an older brother and asked him a few questions, and he told me what had happened. So, irony of ironies, I keep working on the JFK assassination and resolving the riddles, right? The riddle of the optical illusions in the Zapruder film, the riddle of the magic bullet theory that was fake from the get, and then resolution of the discrepancies in the autopsy by revealing that the body of the slain police officer, J.D. Tippit, had been used as a body double for the brain, as an organ for the autopsy, that proved that one bullet had traveled through the brain, except the brain that they were writing up in the Warren Commission report was Officer Tippit's brain, who had been shot through the head with one bullet, that remarkably followed the same track as the ones they purported to be the autopsy diagrams of President Kennedy. So I went on to that, and irony of ironies, as I was saying, as I investigated more and more, got to know people like Jim Mars, started to research more deeply, I came to find that President Kennedy had indeed been slain, in large part because of his intention to reveal the UFO presence to the American public after the 1964 election, and has started to take, he had an initiative and a directive sent to the CIA, the NSA, NASA, FBI, all the Department of Justice, all of the cabinet, all the major intelligence heads, directing them to prepare a white paper for February 1964, detailing all UFOs, all unknowns. That was the jargon. It wasn't UFOs. It's detail all unknowns, all of the Russians, all of the Americans, all of our CIA, NSA, and the different services, Army, Navy, Air Force, and anything left over, meaning besides the Russian. He wanted Russian, American classifications of all the UFOs and whatever was left over, unknowns, because he was on track to expose the alien presence. A lot of people don't know that during his tenure in the Senate and the Congress, he had been very vocal regarding UFO secrecy. And that was because John F. Kennedy had been briefed on the Roswell crash and the contents of the Roswell crash 3 days after it happened. So that was the irony, that I had wanted to keep hush-hush, don't involve UFOs with my Kennedy assassination research. That would discredit me. And then I start to find the documents. I actually did find the document that pointed directly at that. It's the memo that President Kennedy sent to NASA and the CIA on November 12th, 1963, 10 days before he was assassinated. And that was the day that he had a hotline call with Premier Khrushchev discussing the need to share UFO information so that we wouldn't be drawn into a nuclear war, mistaking fleets of UFOs homing in on the homeland and thinking that the Russians were attacking them, us, or we them. And this had happened, as a matter of fact. President Kennedy had the wits scared out of him just 12 days after he was inaugurated. He was inaugurated January 20th, 1961. And on February 2nd, 1961, he was awakened in the middle of the night because of a huge armada of UFOs that were picked up on radar, overflying Eastern Europe and heading right over the NATO nations. And they overflew the NATO nations. They overflew Germany, and Belgium and Denmark and France. They went over the UK, turned north over the North Sea, then back to the west. Excuse me, I just got a message here.
Oh yeah, it's just that you're coming through sometimes a little bit muffled on the mic there. It's like it's almost a little.
Oh, maybe it dropped. Maybe it dropped.
No, it's a little too close to your mouth is what it sounds like actually, just the sound quality. So if we could do something a little too far away now. So
yeah, this is one of those critical position headsets.
okay, we'll just work with it, see what you can do there, and we'll keep you updated. But before we let you carry on any further, one of the things I'd like to just address here is the fact that we've got a co-host who has dropped by, and another character that we were hoping to have join us as well, our chief of security, Kaiser Schuff, for whatever reason has not been able to make it. But we do have Vinny from Brooklyn. So yeah, Vinny, you were here in the after show, or the pre-show rather. Did you manage to make it up to the Crow's Nest?
Hi, Jeffy. I'm here. How are you tonight? How are you, Robert?
I'm doing well, thank you.
So
Excellent.
That's great. So you just, yeah, I'm not sure how things look from your vantage point at the moment. Maybe is there anything outstanding or of note that you'd like to draw to our attention?
Well, we have some weird storms out there, but otherwise it's smooth sailing for us.
Oh.
As far as JFK goes, wow, it was great to hear that someone knew about J.D. Tippit being a dead ringer for JFK.
Oh yeah, no.
I'm not sure if it's common knowledge, but his nickname in the police force was JFK.
That's
if you
right.
can believe that.
That's right.
They used to rib him. They called him Jack and JFK. Those are facts that were discovered first by me, and then those details were from Professor George Michael Ivica, University of Hartford, who worked very closely with me in those years.
Incredible stuff, right?
Yeah. Well.
So Vinny, keep a lookout for whatever happens to be any potential threats or items of interest out there along the horizon, and be sure to keep us up to date in the chat area here. Speaking of which, with YouTube, of course, that chat area.
Can I mention? First of all, we got the Baker's Dozen. We officially got the Baker's Dozen.
That's right.
We have an official. We have a crew tonight. Interesting person competition. Joey Boomer, El Moserino, welcome. Nori Love, Joey Boomer, Carol Sloan, Svetlana Savankova.
Yeah.
I'd like to give a shout out. I'd like to give a shout out to my cousin Louise, who just mentioned it.
Awesome.
Thanks for tuning in. She's also in New York. She's in Rockland County.
Moserino, I think is how maybe you pronounce your last name.
Moserino. Yes.
Kind of Italian sounding surname there.
Yes.
So, right. Well, all right, Vinny. So, and we'll probably check back with you maybe at the midway point here and see how things are going. In the meantime, you can just keep us up to date via the text chat in Skype. And brother. All right. What I like to do now, however, is just kind of backtrack a little bit. And Robert, one of the things we had been talking about actually from the get-go here was getting in a little more to your father's naval history. I find that whole business quite intriguing. And, what more can you tell us as far as his adventures out on the high seas during the course of World War II and beyond?
Well, he had a very interesting life history. He was born in 1907 in Serbo-Croatia. This is, of course, before World War I, when Serbo-Croatia was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And he went to college there in Yugoslavia, this all became Yugoslavia later on. So I was always thought my father was born in Yugoslavia, but they make now a lot of distinctions. Anyway, he was raised on the Dalmatian coast. It's one of the most beautiful coastlines on this planet. So of course you grow up with a love of the sea. He went to sea through the Merchant Marine, and he sailed through the 30s on what we would call, I guess, tramp steamers in those days, or freighters. And in 1939, a very interesting thing happened. He sailed into New York Harbor on a ship called El Nil, or the Nile. And within 24 hours, he jumped ship and got a position on the the SS Washington, which was a luxury liner that was transatlantic passenger liner, which happens to be the one that carried the Kennedy family to England when Joe Kennedy was appointed ambassador to the court of St. James, or ambassador to England. And he stayed on that ship until war broke out, and then he enlisted in the U.S. Army. And the U.S. Army placed him, because of his maritime skills, in the logistics corps, but also because of the many languages that he spoke. My father spoke 5 languages, and as a result of that, he was a very useful intelligence asset to try to ferret out German agents or Italian agents that were working the docks, for example, all along the Gulf Coast and along the East Coast. So he sailed on a ship that was called the SS Andrew Jackson, and he was transferred from that ship just before it got torpedoed. And then he ended the war, again serving in the U.S. Army Logistics Corps, and immediately after the war, he got involved in the Merchant Marine again. He and a partner purchased a ship, and they formed a corporate partnership, and he bought a ship called Tarika, and he made it one of the fastest oil freighters in the Caribbean region. And then he had a really interesting honor conferred upon him in 1947, in that people may not remember, but when the war broke out, all of the docks and the entire coastline of the United States was militarized, and all of the docks and piers and loading, unloading areas were under military control. So after the war, these had to be decommissioned as military bases, and they had to be commissioned again as merchant marine docks, piers, wharfs, etc. So the opening of a port was a significant thing in the post-war era, when the port, and every port went through it, the port of New York, the port of New Orleans, and so on. And it was an honor to be the first ship to sail into the newly opened piers of the civil maritime business that was restored when World War II ended. So he was chosen to sail the first ship into Port of Texas in 1947. And then it was at that time he met my mother, and they romanced and danced, and they made me. So here I am, love child, all these years later, still loving life. And I pursued, because of that interest in maritime affairs and ships and boats, and always living on the coasts, I myself, on the Caribbean, on the Gulf Coast, and of course most of my life on the Atlantic. I had a great love for the sea, and I did 10 years of boating around New York, participating with the Department of Homeland Security in maintaining the Port of New York. So that's, in a nutshell, that's what my father's, as you say, naval. It was naval because he was always on the sea, but he was in the United States Army. And strangely enough, he settled in New Orleans, And I've been able to track down a lot of the things that he was involved with. And interestingly, he was treated for throat cancer by Dr. Alton Oshner, who was the man who hired Judith Vary Baker and Lee Oswald and David Ferry to do the cancer experiments that we're also familiar with nowadays for targeting individuals with cancer viruses that would spring on them in order to assassinate them in a relatively short period of time with no signs.
Hugo Chavez is one of the first more recent prominent cases that comes to mind where you could just say it's a convenient or happy coincidence for some, but maybe a little too much of a happy coincidence to be believable. The fact that
you said the key word. It's too coincidental to be believable. The first person that I remember saying they injected me with cancer, I'm going to die in a couple of weeks.
Jack Ruby.
Jack Ruby.
That's right.
And just imagine how insane that sounded to the people of 1965. Right? He said, "Oh my God, he's in the hospital. He says he shot him up and he's going to die of cancer. How insane is that?" And now we find that he was intimate friend with David Ferry, who was the genius. David Ferry was quite an amazing person and a genius, as was Judith Vary Baker. And I have to say, Oswald was quite a genius himself. He had a much higher than average IQ. And they were all working in this little secret laboratory developing cancer cells that could be used to target individuals. So Jack Ruby got it. Another interesting case, you're sparking my memory. As I recall, there was only one person in the entire Democratic Party who spoke out against the cover-up. I mean, significant person. A couple of Warren Commission commissioners signed and then backed off later on, but they signed on, But Adam Clayton Powell was a very charismatic New York, Harlem congressman. And I remember seeing him on television. They were talking about the Jfk assassination on the Alan Burke show. And I remember he was there smoking and he said, "Oh, come on, Warren Commission report." He says, "Everyone in Washington knows what happened." And then Alan Burke says, "What do you mean?" He says, "Come on. Everybody knows. It's an open secret in Washington, so let's not keep up this." He didn't say any more than that. But within 6 months, he was dead of cancer.
Really? And he had not at that point even been diagnosed? He had not to that point been diagnosed?
He hadn't been diagnosed with cancer. He was there, affable, eloquent, hair slicked back like Cab Calloway, for those old-timers who remember Black Stars from those days. So anyway, that was shocking to me. But again, I said it openly. He's the only Democrat that spoke against the cover-up. And that's because the Democratic Party went along with the murder of President Kennedy. One of the most disgusting pieces of video that I have to watch every once in a while when I'm working on a documentary is Lyndon Johnson's entrance into the halls of Congress for the joint session of Congress that he addressed on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, the week after President Kennedy was assassinated, butchered, buried, half buried in Arlington. And when he walked in, they all gave him a standing ovation. All of them knowing by Wednesday his role in the assassination. And what you see is 100 senators and countless congressmen standing up in fear and terror, applauding as madly as they can for the new dictator, just the way they did when Saddam Hussein took office. The terror, the fear in whatever that was called, the Iraqi parliament, overclapping. Well, watch that videotape and you'll understand why I despise those Democrats, so-called Democrats.
Yeah, I've seen that video actually, and you're exactly right. And I could not agree any further, of course. So I think it's up there on YouTube, and people can.
Yes, you'll find it there.
Sure.
But you do agree with me about the overclapping, the strain that they all were under to just give him a claim he did not deserve. That man, Lyndon Johnson, if John F. Kennedy had lived through that afternoon, on Monday, Lyndon Johnson was going to be impeached because on that afternoon, at 2 p.m. that afternoon, the House Ethics Committee that had been investigating his corruption was coming out with its report, and he was going to be impeached. And the story was already set up in Time and Life magazine to be run that week. And instead, the Kennedy assassination overshadowed that. Johnson became president. That committee was dismissed. The findings were dissolved. And Johnson went on to lead us into Vietnam and to cause the death of 58,000 of my generation.
Santos Traficante was somebody else who found themselves in a pretty tough pickle, as it were. RFK, I guess, was really, holding his feet to the fire, in that Traficante was in court at the time of the assassination, from what I understand.
No, I think you're confusing him with Marcello.
Carlos Marcello. Okay, all right.
Yeah, birds of a feather. They all look alike.
Yeah, and
all mafia guys look alike.
Well, and they're all kind of, everyone's getting their cut of the action, and piece of the action, cut of the pie, I guess, too, right? So
hey, let me give you some updates, some very interesting new discoveries that I've made over the last few years that I've been kind of low key about. And the big part of it is the involvement in one assassination group, right? There were several squads. Okay, so let's call it one assassination squad that was present in Dealey Plaza was the Chicago mob squad from Giancana. And Giancana had Charles Nicoletti, and he had Richard Kane as two of the assassins. Now, Richard Kane is a guy who wore horn-rimmed glasses and was wearing a tan raincoat that day. And he was the guy who was shooting from the 6th floor Texas School Book Depository and missed. And he was the crack shot. He was the guy who was supposed to put it where it was supposed to be. And if he had done his job, nobody else would have had to fire. But because he missed, the others were forced to fire. And so he wound up in the doghouse afterwards. And Sam Giancana loathed him and tortured him. And here's the key. I found film of the police stopping a guy walking out of the Texas School Book Depository because a policeman in the building looked out the window and yelled down to the cops, said, "Hey, stop that guy, stop that guy." So the cops stopped him and started interrogating him. And on the film, even the narrator says, you can see this guy has been drinking a little bit early in the day here. He looks a little tipsy. But when I looked at his face, I realized, oh my God, that's Richard Kane. So Richard Kane was in the building, and he had been trying to sneak out of the Texas School Book Depository. When a cop spotted him and pointed him out to another cop, and an alert newsman with his camera picked up this little scene. Hey, this cop's stopping this guy. I wonder why. So he started shooting it, and he recorded the presence of Richard Kane in Dealey Plaza. He's right in front of the Texas School Book Depository. Later on, as I said, he got put in the doghouse. And if you've ever read Double Cross, the biography by his brother, Giancana's brother, wrote a biography of Sam. He was an insane psychopath. He tortured people in loathsome ways. And he really had it out for Richard Kane. But that blew over, except in 1973, there's now 10 years later, Richard Kane walked into a bar in Chicago and had too many drinks, and he started shooting off his mouth. And he said that he had been involved in the JFK assassination. A couple of days later, some men walked into that bar with handkerchiefs over their faces, hats, and dark coats. They singled out everybody out of the crowd, singled out Richard Kane. They told everybody in the crowd to get against the wall, look at the wall, don't turn around. They put a gun in Richard Kane's mouth and they blew his head off. And then, let's see, about 3 years later, Sam Giancana and Charles Nicoletti were both assassinated in Nicoletti's house, his mansion in Chicago, just before they were supposed to testify, or Giancana had been subpoenaed by the Congress to testify before the church committee. So I relate this to just show people, justice does get done. Everybody thought, oh, they all got away with it, but they didn't. They all had to pay the piper sooner or later.
Sure. This Richard Kane character is someone that I've not heard too much of until actually, I think the first I'd ever heard of him was courtesy of you and the last time we spoke. Yeah, I guess then you're not a believer in the theory that it was William Mack, was it Mack Wallace, who according
Mack Wallace. So here's the key. This guy looked like Mack Wallace.
Okay. Well, they found according to Roger Stone, they did find a partial fingerprint in the sniper's nest of Mack Wallace's, but I mean, were there two of them? Were the two of them there together?
There were two shooters. Dig this. There were two shooters on the 6th floor. One in one window, the Oswald window, but on the other side of the floor was another open window, which actually had a clearer shot at the president, because the oak trees that are in front of the depository were not in the way. So that was the thing. At first I thought it was Mack Wallace. And yes, Mack Wallace was up there and was probably the guy that helped move some of those boxes into the so-called sniper's nest, because I got a copy of that fingerprint, and I was able to compare it to the Mack Wallace police print, replicating the work that had been done by the fingerprint expert that you see on the History Channel talking about it. So I confirmed that he did it, because when I was with, from 2003 to 2012, 2013, I was with DHS, and I was also a certified fingerprint technician.
Okay, so you managed to get your hands on the partial fingerprint.
I was able to compare them on the computer.
Right.
And I agree that it's Mack Wallace's fingerprint there.
Mm-hmm.
The use of doubles is all over the Kennedy assassination.
Right.
We know about the doubles, right? Tippit and JFK were doubles. We know about the Oswald doubles.
Robert, here's one thing that we have not talked about or drawn to listeners' attention to this point: the fact why we're talking so much about JFK at this particular moment, and not the standard, as we like to do here, the roundtable format and approach that we take every, I guess, third week in November, just right around the time of the November 22nd assassination. But it's because his birthday's coming up quite shortly, so I'm not sure if you'd like to tie that into things or
I'd
not.
love to talk about that.
Yeah,
I'd love to talk about that, because you know what, the JFK assassination is something that really distracts us from the really wonderful thing, which was the rest of JFK's life. As a matter of fact, when Robert Kennedy got word that his brother had been slain, he said he had a wonderful life. It's quite an epitaph. So let me talk a little bit about that, his earlier life. He was a very sickly kid. Had to spend a lot of time indoors, recuperating from illnesses, colds, flus, etc. So he became a voracious reader. Then when he got into high school, he became an athlete, became a very good swimmer. And when he went to Harvard, he competed in swimming. His father was involved in smuggling whiskey across the Great Lakes in very fast speedboats. And I suspect that JFK was around that scene, fast speedboats outrunning the Coast Guard during the Prohibition. Then he went to Harvard. He also went to Stanford because he caught the clap and they had to vacate the scene at Harvard while he went through treatment. And then he went to Stanford for a while. And he earned a nickname out there. They used to call him the Beast from the East. Then he went back to Harvard. Then the war broke out. And of course, he joined the Navy and wound up in the PT boat. PT boats were like the fighter craft on the sea of World War II, amazing boats with Merlin engines, if I recall correctly. Yeah, American hulls with Merlin engines. And when he was out there, he was in the thick of it. He was in Guadalcanal, and he patrolled the waters of Guadalcanal. Now, when you see movies about PT boats, most memorable one being They Were Expendable with John Wayne, shows you PT boats attacking battleships and blowing up cruisers and all that kind of stuff. But in reality, the PT boat was being used more as a stealthy spy craft. And as a result, JFK was navigating the waters of near Guadalcanal and off northern Guadalcanal. And he then was tracking the Japanese troop shipments and logistics that were supplying those islands as they did the island hopping campaign to defeat the Japanese. And during the course of one of those missions, he got caught on a dark night with his engines in neutral, and his boat was cleaved in two by a Japanese destroyer that didn't even know they'd hit him. The night was so black, it was a moonless night. And the rest of the story is the saga of PT-109, how he saved, I think, 11 of his, 10 of his men. 2 died, and he saved them. They saved each other, actually. Swam to small islets, survived for days. And he kept swimming out with a lantern into the channel at night, hoping that one of the patrol boats looking for them would find them. And they were not successful. Then some natives came upon them, some aborigines, as we used to call them. This was in the Solomon Islands, Polynesians. And one of them took a coconut. There's the famous coconut story. Kennedy carved a message on a coconut, and he gave it to the Polynesian native. And they went on their canoe back and contacted a coast watcher. I think he was an Australian or a New Zealander coast watcher, who read the coconut and said, "Oh my God, Kennedy's alive." And so they sent a rescue boat to pick him up. Welcome to the sounds of New York City news, folks. That's the real background of New York City, Manhattan.
Yeah, we always manage to get at least one or two decent blasts or fire alarms or ambulances.
Yeah, the police should be here any minute.
That's
the police
right.
Should be here any second. It's Friday night. So anyway, that saga is a very interesting one because it left the Navy in a quandary. He had done this amazingly heroic thing in helping rescue the men and surviving, but he had lost his ship. Right? He had been out there, and the mistake was that he had his engines in neutral. They said that if he had been in gear, he might have just been able to peel out of the way, but because it was just standing, holding station, dead in the water, as we say, he wound up, 2 guys dead and boat cleaved in two, floating on half of the hull for the rest of the morning, till they saw an islet and were able to swim to it. But anyway, the Navy was left in a lurch, and we're like, what are we going to do with this guy? You know, and some people wanted to court-martial him for losing the PT boat, and the others said, no, you know, we're not going to do that. Especially, we're not going to do that to the son of the former ambassador to England, Joe Kennedy, the man who made Franklin Delano Roosevelt president. Now, folks, this is something I've never talked about before. Why was Joseph Kennedy so powerful in the United States? And the answer is, it was Joseph Kennedy who got the idea to run Franklin Delano Roosevelt for president in 1932. And as a result, he approached, Roosevelt was a former governor of New York, and he was approached, and Roosevelt said to Joe Kennedy, he said, you organize it, you organize the steering committee, and you get the nomination, and I'll do it. And so Joe Kennedy and James Farley and a third Irishman who owned a newspaper in New York City made this committee to nominate Franklin Roosevelt president, became the steering committee, became the campaign committee, and they worked on Roosevelt's campaigns all those years. He was a kingmaker. That's what Joseph Kennedy was to Roosevelt. He had made him president of the United States, and he had kept him president of the United States. So when his son had this horrible mishap, they were left with a choice. Either we're going to disgrace him and irritate the president, or we're going to give him a medal. So they gave him the Navy Cross. And as a result of that legend and history of courage and valor, he became a very good candidate. Now, let me tell you something else. He bumped somebody out of the position to run for Congress from his district. Someone else was already running. And Kennedy, at that time, was not really a resident of Massachusetts. Kennedy and the Kennedy clan lived in Palm Beach, Florida. And so the guy who was going to run for the Congress in that district in Massachusetts, I think it was Brookline or Cambridge, was a gentleman named Ben Ferguson, and he was Joseph Kennedy's lawyer. So somebody gets the idea that Jack should run for Congress in Massachusetts. So they're not residents. So what do? You got to talk to the lawyer, right? So Joe Kennedy goes up to Ben and he says, hey, Ben, I hear you have some plans to run for Congress. And he says, yeah, Joe, I'm planning to run for Congress. He says, well, Ben, I don't think you're going to do that. And he said, oh, why? He says, well, because my son Jack wants to run for Congress in that district. And he said, oh. So I talked, and this is coming directly from the man who lived it. He was Joe Kennedy's lawyer. He told me this. And he said, well, all right, Joe, if that's what you want. But what are we going to do about residency? He said, well, that's why I came to see you. Maybe we can fix that up. So he did fix it up. And when he told me that he had fixed up this residency for JFK to run for Congress, I said to him, Ben, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart, because if you hadn't done that, John F. Kennedy would not have been president, and we might have gone up in a nuclear holocaust in 1962 if any other man had been in the White House. And that man would have definitely been Richard Nixon.
Yeah,
by the way,
that's important to take note of.
Did you want to say something about the moon?
Well, yeah, at some point. But before we do that, what I'd like to acknowledge here is the fact that this is Pirate Radio Podcast, episode number 145, with our special return guest, Manhattan, New York native, Robert Morningstar. So, as listeners have probably managed to figure out, to this point, we've been talking pretty much all things JFK. Almost managed to eat up an entire hour. Amazing how time flies when you're having fun out here on, via the Robin Hood out upon the high digital seas. So we're going to get into that whole moon business in just a minute. We know it's something that definitely intrigues you, as well as many others, of course. But before we do that, I think it's maybe time we heard back from Vinny up there in the crow's nest. He's been hopefully managing to keep a pretty careful and close watch on things. Do we have you on the other end of the line, Vinny?
Hey, nobody has more fun than us, brother. Hey, we have 15 watching right now. How about that? Nethead has joined us also. So hail and welcome, everybody.
Yeah, it's great. We're doing well as far as the numbers are concerned. And, of course, there's always people that do manage to come along and check things out after the live stream has been recorded. So not too shabby as far as these independent, online, underground, digital conversations are concerned. Is there anything else that you'd like to take note of, or to just get out there before we return back to the conversation with Robert here?
Oh, hey, listen, we have some great stuff that we're hearing tonight. It's incredible. It's great to hear new stuff about JFK for once. So just continue. Thank you very much, Robert.
Thanks, Vin.
Yeah, he's really getting a few of the particulars here that I've never heard of to this point. So he's definitely, as he promised just a few minutes ago, managing to present to us here some of the more obscure and largely unknown facts regarding the whole history and legend of JFK. One of the things before...
Hey, Cappy,
yeah.
What we're going to do is we're going to put the real story together, because what we've been told all those years ago was a complete fabrication. I mean, it was just so pathetic, and it's just incredible that this whole thing has gone by all this time and people have just not said anything, and it's amazing. So I'm happy someone's saying something now.
Yeah, well, there's always at least two versions of the story and events that occur: the official narrative and then the truth. So I find that often, the official narrative is typically, for largely political reasons, sexed up or juiced up or just spun off in a way to serve certain people's interests. But it's always great, to hear from people such as Robert, who spent extensive amount of time doing his research and really working on getting a clear sense of things. Now, one of the questions that we actually had from the Peanut Gallery, actually this is last night, coming to us via our friend out there in Florida, Tommy Shutter, who you may have come across a time or two yourself, Robert, a.k.a. Free Cosmos. He hosts Free People of the Cosmos show.
Hi, Tommy.
Yeah. And what he was wondering about, actually, he wanted us to ask you about how the night that you saw JFK, apparently an apparition, materialize at the foot of your bed. So without spending too much time on all this, because we got to keep things rolling along here. We've only got a little more than 30 minutes left. Once again, amazing how we can eat up time here as things go. But what happened on this particular night?
Since you broached the subject, I will tell you that I described John F. Kennedy today as the only man who solved his own murder. And that's because I had a near-death experience on March 30th, 1981, on the night of the day that Ronald Reagan was shot. I was at Oberlin College as a visiting professor, lecturer in the East Asian Studies Department, where I went to teach, let's call it Asian history. I'd made some amazing discoveries in Tai Chi, and I was there to lecture on it. And that day, Reagan had been, and I was reading a book called Perilandra by C.S. Lewis. And at about 10:30 at night, I was in a dorm called Spanish House at Oberlin College. And I was, I'd been listening to the reports on President Reagan and his critical condition all day. And that moment, as I was going to bed, I put the book down and I walked across the room and I said, there's something really evil walking on this planet. It's killing good men. And it's always the same story, lone gunman and lone nut. Something really evil walking this planet. And with that thought, I lay in bed. I pulled up the sheet and I lay there with my eyes open, taking in a room which was illuminated by street light coming in, ambient street light. That was actually just as high as the second floor dorm, second floor of the dorm that I was in. And out of the corner of my eye, I see something. My peripheral vision picks up something. And I look to my left, and I was in a room with two beds. I was in the one near the door. There was a space and a desk and another bed, and then a wall. And out of that wall emerges a white form, a white figure that starts to walk across the floor ever so slowly. And the moment, imagine how you'd feel. I sleep naked, by the way. And so I'm lying in bed, naked, a sheet over me or a blanket over me. My arms are out of the blanket, and I look, and this figure in white from head to foot, a white headdress, a white shroud, a white robe, a white cincture, and he's flowing across the floor ever so slowly. And my body starts to tremble. My body starts to shake. My heart starts to pound. And I'm realizing I'm having an otherworldly experience. However, 7 years before, I had had another otherworldly experience, which was the visitation of my Tai Chi master. When he died, his ghost came to me. And as he approached me, anytime anybody sees a ghost, you get scared. As he approached me and I became afraid, he said to me, "Don't be afraid, Robert. Nothing can harm you." And I received that and I accepted it and I trusted it. And my Tai Chi master spirit came over to me and touched me on the forehead and imparted a blessing and imparted knowledge that became resident in me after he left. Right? He walked away, evaporated. And I said to myself, oh my God, this is just like the teleportation machine on Star Trek. So that memory came back to me, and that recollection of what he said to me, don't be afraid, Robert, nothing can harm you. So I seized on that in my heart and my soul, and I surrounded myself in love, and I started saying to this being, I love you, but I don't want to see your face. I love you, but I don't want to see your face. That became my mantra. I gathered up all the love in my being. I centered myself in my heart and my mind and my soul. As my body went into spasms, tremors, shakes, rattles, goosebumps that were hitting the wall, it was a level of fear and terror that is unimaginable to anyone who has not been through it. So as he's approaching, and he's approaching extremely slowly. This is taking me a long time to tell you, because this took a long time to happen. This was not a flash in the dark. It was a long, enduring experience. So he's walking very slowly, and I'm going to recite my thoughts to you. Oh my God, this is the most powerful person that's ever walked the earth. Oh my God. He knows I'm scared, but he's giving me time. He's approaching me, the familiar Tai Chi walk. He knows I'm scared. He's trying not to scare me. Oh my God, who could this be? He's walking. He's coming across. Now he's crossed. This is the time from the wall to crossing the second bed adjacent to my bed. He's coming closer and looming larger. And he's coming across, and it's a very tall figure, exceptionally upright, meaning to say perfectly straight up, No slouching, no stooping, no leaning. He was like a vertical being. He walked like a lion. He's coming across the foot of my bed, and now my heart is pounding incessantly like that. And I look in my chest and I say, if I didn't have this concrete vest on, my heart would just break out and jump out of my chest. Because I felt like I had a vault of concrete surrounding my heart that was keeping it in. And I said to myself, oh my God, this is death. This is why they find people dead in the morning and say, oh, this poor guy had a heart attack. So he comes and he starts to turn the foot of my bed. And I said to myself, my God, this is antimatter. Now that was an insight that has remained with me ever since then. Oh my God, this is antimatter, or the Beck. I'll explain what Beck is later. I learned the name of it later on. So he comes around and says, oh my God, this is antimatter. If we touch, poof, annihilation. I could die. So he's coming closer. Now he's at the side of my bed, standing by my right side, in close proximity to my shoulder and my rib cage. And he starts to lean over me. And I said to him, please, first of all, I had never stopped saying, I love you, but I don't want to see your face. I love you, but I don't want to see your face. I'm crying, man. I love you, but I don't want to see your face. Please, please, please don't lift the veil. I'm really strong, I said to him, humbly, not boastfully. I'm really strong, stronger than most mortals are, but if you lift the veil, I think I'll die. So please don't lift the veil. So what he did is he took the veil and he pressed it against his face, and the veil was translucent. And he leaned down and he put his nose to my nose. I would say 3 inches away from my nose. Yeah. Take your three middle fingers, put them on the end of your nose. And that's how far away he was with me face to face. And I didn't know who it was.
Were you
And I look at
were you able to move, Robert, or were you frozen in fear?
I was able to move. I was trembling. I was in spasms. I was contorted. I actually wrote a very long poem about this that I read on Richard Hoagland's show at Easter. And if you go to Richard Hoagland's archives, I think it's still up. It was Easter Sunday, and it was about the fire in Notre Dame and this war of evil against
Right.
religion
Yeah.
globally.
Let's
And
not.
this is the message
Yeah. Well,
that this spirit brought to me.
let's.
So he says to me,
Robert,
look at my
let me just jump in
face.
for a second. I'm going to remind
Remember me.
listeners this is
And I
important.
said to him,
Whoops.
who are you? Who are you? I know you. I know you, but I haven't seen you in so long. And he says to me again. This time it was imperative. The first one was a request. Look at my face. Remember me. The second one was imperative. Look at my face. Remember me. And again I said, who could you be? Could you be the Christ? Could you be my soul? Could you be the soul of a Sufi master or someone? Who are you? I know you, but I haven't seen you in so long. And then he said to me, we don't want you speaking to people of what you know. And I said, we? Where are you coming from? And he said to me, Lucifer has taken over Islam and is going to use it as his vehicle to destroy mankind. And I took it in and I said, I understand. He nodded his head a little bit, he came upright, and he walked away in exactly the same way, exactly the same long, enduring, slow, eternal walk. He went over by the foot of my bed. Now, when he leaned over me and he came close, and his robe probably lay on me. I was in such contortions and tremors and shakes and spasms. Actually, I was hearing screaming. I heard screaming in my body, in my being. Every cell knew its mortality. And every cell, as an individual little ego, was screaming bloody murder, as we would say. And he stood up, he walked out. I saw him go the same way, long, slow pace, and right out through the wall. And when he disappeared through the wall, I bolted up. I was bathed in sweat. I was shaking in tremors, and all I could say was, "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God." And it just went on like that for minutes, shaking and trembling and cold as hell. I felt, when he approached me, I felt as if somebody had taken me stark naked and thrown me out into Antarctica. That all the life was being sucked out of my body. And I have a theory that it may be that the ghost field uses our life force to generate a magnetic field that makes it possible for a spirit form like that to precipitate. Think about it in terms of rain and clouds. All the water, the water's still up there. We don't see the clouds because the air pressure is too high, but when the air pressure drops, the water molecules get closer and clouds form, and if it gets lower, the water precipitates and we have rain. So I think that ghosts precipitate. So anyway, that I didn't know who it was. Didn't know it was, but that face, that inscrutable face, powerful, most powerful, jaw, cheeks, stern lips, and the gaze, right through the veil. It burned it. It burned that image in my mind. And so it was that 12, 13 years later, I looked at a photograph of Officer Tippit, and I said, "Hey, where have I seen that expression before?" Something it was a subconscious thing. This looks, and you know what? At that time, there was only one picture of Officer Tippit that had ever been released in the 30 years. I'm talking about 1993. In 30 years since President Kennedy had been assassinated and Tippit had been killed, only one picture of Tippit had ever been shown. And it was a 1952 picture of Tippit when he was about 26. But Tippit was 39, going on 40, much older man. So the key to this is I didn't recognize the ghost because the expression was so alien to the person that he was. But the expression was the expression that I would need to know to recognize the expression in the only picture of Officer Tippit available to the general public for 30 years. And slowly, very slowly, this realization erupted because the way I discovered the Tippit body swap, brain and body swap, was that a girlfriend of mine in 1993 said to me, "Robert, how was Tippit shot? How did Tippit die?" And I said to her, "The New York Times said that Tippit had been shot through the right eye and that he had been horribly disfigured and been buried in a sealed casket and that nobody, not even his family, had been allowed to see the body. But let me check." And I reached, at arm's length was a book called The Day Kennedy Was Shot by Jim Bishop. So I go through the index, I look at Tippit, death of Tippit, I go to death of Tippit, and I read Jim Bishop was one of the top reporters in the United States at the time. He had gotten the autopsy report somehow, and he wrote up that Tippit had been taken by surprise. He had been shot 3 times in the abdomen, the torso. One bullet hit a button that went, the brass button on the police tunic went into his body and slid across and created a gouge. This is an important point. Then the assailant walked over to the Tippit body, who's not yet dead, he's dying, and he put a gun to his head, point blank at the temple, and fired a single bullet into his brain. When I read that sentence, I said, this is it. This is the answer to the JFK assassination mystery and the riddle around the brain autopsy report, because we all know from the Zapruder film that President Kennedy, and of course the hospital room, they said more than half his brain was gone, liquefied. But the Warren Commission report describes the whole brain, both sides intact, cerebral peduncles and the different organs and bodies in the brain, and it's not JFK's brain. So I said, oh well, here it is. I just found the brain. They used Tippett's brain and they gave it to the autopsist, and they said, okay, this brain was, died because it had one bullet go through the head. Yes, it was Tippett's brain. They could never have looked at half a brain, most of it gone and evaporated into the Dallas atmosphere, and the rest of it in a bucket in Parkland. Nobody could look at half a brain or 2/3 of a brain and say, one bullet passed through this brain. But they could say it about Tippett because the bullet entered the temple, traveled through, hit the back of his skull, but didn't exit. There's another key point. There's a famous back of the skull photograph, or back of the head photograph, where a hand is holding up the head. It looks really wet. Well, I found a really good copy of that photograph back in the 1990s, and when I improved it, enhanced it, and went into the bullet hole, quote unquote hole, it's not a hole. It's a depression. And I knew it was a depression because hairs were still growing out of it. So the bullet hit the skull, cracked it. Like when a BB hits a windshield, right?
Yeah.
BB hits a windshield,
Sure.
boom.
Yeah.
It at least had a little beveled contour on the part where the impact occurred, and that's what happened to Tippett's skull. So the autopsist had to open up Tippett's skull to remove the bullet, and he did this by 3 o'clock. Imagine this: the autopsy is signed, sealed, and delivered 3 o'clock in the afternoon of November 22nd. And so the discrepancies in the autopsy of the Bethesda brain was that they described a parasagittal laceration on the right side. And when I read that, as did David Lifton, it really made no sense, because a parasagittal laceration is not something that a bullet would make, right? It's talking about a slice, something sliced into the brain. Obviously, that was the slice that Dr. Earl Rose had to make into Tippett's brain in order to pull out the bullet before they shipped the body off to Bethesda.
So, and just to be clear then, your theory is that Tippett's brain was needed as evidence in replacement or exchange of what was left of JFK's brain, which apparently wasn't all that much, in order to uphold the single bullet theory.
Yeah, exactly.
They knew that right from the get-go then, that they had to really push and promote the single gunman, single.
Yeah, they had every corner, every base covered, as they say. But listen, this is not new. These are plays. It's just like the NFL teams have a playbook, right? These are intelligence. These are intelligence plays that go back hundreds of years. And the one I just described to you, you can read in Shakespeare in a play called Measure for Measure. The climax comes when a corrupt official wants to execute an innocent man of whom he is very jealous, because the innocent man is loved by the girl that the villain likes, right? So he's set him up, framed him, and he's about to be executed. And so this very smart priest, who happens to have the same name as my father, Father Ludovic, he comes up with a plan, and he says, listen, tomorrow there are going to be 2 executions. This really guilty guy, this murderer, is supposed to be executed in the afternoon, and Antonio is supposed to be executed in the morning. So we got to arrange for the criminal who's supposed to be executed in the afternoon to be killed in the morning. So then the killing means cutting off his head. So he says, so we'll arrange that, and then you take the head and you walk into the governor's office with the head and tell him, hey, look, I did the job. He's dead. That'll give us time to get in touch with the Duke, who's in this other city, and give him time to come here and settle this whole affair. So he says, oh, come on, that's never going to work. And he says, of course it's going to work. Do you realize do you ever seen a reaction of a person when they sees a decapitated head? They don't stop to look and identify it. He'll just turn his his face away in disgust. Do it. It's our only hope. So they arrange it, and they execute the criminal in the morning, which is when the hero was supposed to be executed, and the report was supposed to be to the villain governor by noon. And so the guy takes the head, walks in, says, Governor, the deed is done. Here, look. And the governor goes, get that out of my face. Folks, we're talking about the 1500s, right? We're talking about the oldest intelligence agencies on the planet and the newest intelligence agency on the planet, because this was a joint intelligence operation that involved inside the U.S. government, outside the U.S. government, and players in Europe who helped the affair. As a matter of fact, we know now who the assassin, the real super killer. I mean, JFK was killed 4 times over, but the one that blew his brains out with the explosive bullet, the French assassin, we know his name. And it is a result of the work of an Air Force major named Ralph P. Gannis. And he found the mastermind of the JFK assassination to have been Hitler's top commando, Otto Skorzeny. Otto Skorzeny, who rescued Mussolini from the mountaintop, turned into a paperclip Nazi after the war, but he did not come to the United States. He stayed in Europe, running an assassination office in Madrid. And from that office in Madrid, he was imagine, Hitler's top commando, like the highest of the Green Berets, and remarkable engineer. So he was able to engineer multiple assassinations across Europe and the United States, because the facts emerged that the assassination apparatus that Skorzeny let loose on JFK had been operating in the South and in the United States already for 10 years, since the 1950s. So the French assassin's name is René Soutre. He went by 2 names, Michel Mertz, M-E-R-T-Z, and René Soutre, S-O-U-T-R-E. And it took me all these years, now 55 years, to see the picture of the man who really killed President Kennedy, or one of the main man. Let's call it the main man. And a lot of people got chip shots off that Irish skull. So anyway, to finish off the story about the ghost, I did all this work on the JFK assassination, and in 1995, I was invited to visit England and to be a guest of the ancient Druid Order of England at Stonehenge on the summer solstice. We got there at midnight, and a certain Druid, dear friend, dearly departed friend, named Jerome Whitney, became my friend and mentor. We arrived, and they started putting on their robes. And when I saw Jerome put on his robe, a white robe from shoulder to the ground, then I saw him put on his white headdress, like a pharaoh, which was like the one that came into my room, which is why I said, are you a Sufi? But no shroud. But now he wears the shroud because my dear friend Jerome Whitney passed away earlier this year. And I'm sure he's happy that I'm thinking about him and telling you this story, because it's an affirmation of my faith in life and my faith in life after death, and the power of love to transcend death. Because when Ronald Reagan was shot, the ghost of President Kennedy rose out of the grave and reached out to someone who loved him. And he reached out to me for help. and I helped him. And so today, President Kennedy rests in peace because we are witnessing the demolition and the destruction of the deep state that slaughtered him. And so, the reason I did not recognize his face is that he showed me his face with the expression that I would need to know 13 years later and see it in Officer Tippit. And so I had to search then for more pictures of Tippit to make my case. And ultimately, I found not only a picture of Officer Tippit, a frontal picture, but one of President Kennedy with a very dour and grave look on his face, which was very close to it. And I was able to section the two photographs by hand, photographic work, not computer work. And if you type into Google JFK-Morningstar and hit images, among the top images, you are going to see a split face photograph that I did in I believe it was 1996. Half of it is Officer Tippit, half of it is President Kennedy. And from the brow down, they look like identical twins. The differences are above the brow, where Tippit had a receding hairline and President Kennedy had a fuller hairline, slightly different color. Tippit had moles on his ear and moles on his neck, as does the victim in the Bethesda photographs. And I met President Kennedy's cousin, Kerry McCarthy, nay Kennedy. And I asked her, I said, Kerry, you swam with Jack growing up. You saw him in a bathing suit. Did he have any moles on his chest, on his neck? And she said, no, he had no moles. I said, of course not. The man in the photographs that we are given as President Kennedy in the morgue are Officer J.D. Tippit, dressed up, shaved and powdered, and part of his head filled in with plaster, dressed up by a mortician, guy I sarcastically call the Michelangelo of morticians, named John Liggett, whose wife revealed that he was the master mortician in Dallas and had been called away when President Kennedy was shot, and had disappeared for 24 hours and came back distraught and haggard and split town. He split Dallas instantly with his family and headed to San Antonio, Texas, heading for Mexico. They stopped in a motel and watched TV. And on Sunday, they watched Oswald come out and they saw Ruby shoot him and kill him. And John Liggett jumped up and he said, okay, pack up your bags. We're going back home. We don't have to go to Mexico anymore. So,
Interesting.
55 years, But honestly, I would not have gotten there had I not had spiritual direction and spiritual protection. Because a lot of people got killed for knowing much less than what I've just told you, including the late Dorothy Kilgallen, who discovered what I've just told you 2 years after the assassination in 1965. So she was assassinated in turn.
Well, how you're saying that she knew about the body switch?
Oh, yeah, she knew about Tippit. She was going to break the story.
Right.
And just before she did, she announced it. She said she was going to say something about Officer Tippit, but it never came out.
No kidding. Interesting. How about that? So, well, actually speaking of Tippit, we do have that photo that you did reference, him and JFK side by side there in the slideshow. So hopefully people have managed to take a look at that. Number of other pictures that you have provided to us just recently, as well as over the past couple of years. I'd like to thank everybody who's been hanging out here with us over the course of the past nearly hour and a half. Now, not quite. We still got a few minutes to go here, and hoping we can shift gears and maybe take the focus on over to, just in brief, the recent news regarding the moon, as well as you had a thing or two to say about Memorial Day that I thought was quite interesting and noteworthy. Yeah. If you manage to stick around during the course of the after show, which is completely optional for our feature guests, they're welcome to join us. But I know, of course, out where you are, it's getting pretty late.
Sure, I can stay tonight.
Okay, well,
Tonight
sure.
I'll hang out for another half hour.
Okay, well that's great. But what I think would be best if we address now, and of course we could just keep the focus on JFK the whole conversation and still never manage to cover it all. But Dorothy Kilgallen, what a figure, and somebody who, is it's well worth people, if they have not to this point, definitely taking a look at, checking out her background, and just another one of those coincidences where she so tragically lost her life under the circumstances in which she was found. But leaving all this business with respect to JFK and your mystical vision and so forth, which is extremely fascinating, of course, very profound, and quite something. I'm sure some people will have a hard time grasping what you're getting at, but then others, when people present stories and information like this to myself and our listeners, the three possibilities that I can come up with is either they're lying, they're crazy, or it's the truth. It's the real thing.
And how about all of the above?
Well, I guess it
doesn't work. No, actually, this happened in 1981. And I was 33 years old when this happened to me. And I kept it close to my vest, secret, only my closest confidants and friends and students. And now I'm 70 years old, heading on 71. And it's time for people to know it. I don't really care what they think. It's an affirmation of my belief system, giving you an insight into what my motivation has been and has always been in pursuing justice for JFK. That was the name of my first electronic book in 1993, Justice for JFK. Now even that word has been hijacked to socialist political agendas. But you mentioned Memorial Day, and the point I was making to a friend is that we were tricked out of the reverence. Memorial Day is something you should never say happy about. You should never be happy about Memorial Day. You should never say Happy Memorial Day, and never say it to a service person, because it's not a happy memorial. It's a grave, serious, reverent memorial. And I was saying to Jaffe that one of the tricks of the socialists to desensitize us to the sacred and turn reverence into irrelevance is by changing the date or the celebration of the occasion from the actual date, which has historic and spiritual significance, and transposing it to the closest Monday so that everybody can have a 3-day weekend. All right. And so instead of having a reverential attitude on Memorial Day and revering the heroes that have made our freedoms possible, we have a sale at some such, buy your big TV for $250. Oh, race right down there. Oh, have a happy barbecue on Memorial Day. No, man, it's not about that. And as far as July 4th, the same thing. When I was a kid, July 4th was not called July 4th. July 4th was the date on which we celebrated Independence Day. And by shifting the name and transposing it to the closest Monday to the date, again, we desanctify the date itself. And I do believe holy. I think July 4th, Independence Day, was a holy day in the history of mankind. And it's been trifled with. Yeah, it's been trifled with. And they have turned it into July 4th, which is just a day in the calendar. It's not July 4th, 1776, Independence Day. So let's celebrate our independence, and let's revere our heroes and pay the due respect that they merit.
Independence from Britain, of course, and over in Britain, they are finding themselves in the midst of some pretty big change at the moment, it seems. Theresa May, the Prime Minister, finally announcing her resignation, long overdue, of course. A lot of people waiting and wondering when she would finally come to see the light, as it were, and realize that her time in place and in power was she overstayed her welcome by a pretty fair margin, of course. So yeah, I'm not really 100% up to speed on what is really occurring over there, other than it seems like the country will be now shifting its focus more away to a pro-sovereignty type agenda and outlook on the world, rather than being ruled by Brussels under the
Right.
EU agenda, of course. So yeah, I agree totally as well. That's great. I think countries can still get along without having to exist under some multinational umbrella. So, but
let me remind you of something.
Sure.
Britain has never been our friend. Britain is not our friend.
Redcoats. Yes, the Redcoats.
The Redcoats. And, World War II made us into allies. And their dependence on us kept them as allies. But what is coming out now with the demolition of the deep state and the exposure of the role of MI6 in setting up the Trump sting, it's getting very, very, it's getting very bad, and that's why Theresa May may be departing sooner than expected.
Well, and interesting.
Because
so
she had to know about these activities of Alison Saunders and Arvinder Sambai, who are part of the Privy Council and part of the British intelligence network. They set up George Papadopoulos. They told George Papadopoulos to meet with Stephen Halper and Averna Tarek, the bombshell that tried to seduce Papadopoulos. And they have also they orchestrated, as I said, plays. Remember I said the JFK assassination was a playbook play? Well, this is another playbook play. The sting, right? Set up a target, give him information, lure him somewhere, make him make a statement, use the statement he made as evidence when it's really, you might say, circular logic or disinformation. If you don't mind, and if you have a little time, I'd love to read you 3 paragraphs from the FISA. Do you know that the president today announced that he's declassifying all of the documents, whatever documents are necessary to get to the bottom of the Russia collusion hoax? And one of the big players has been John Solomon of the Hill in Washington. And he submitted a 19-page motion to release the documents before the FISA court. So I'd just like to read you the last 2 paragraphs and the conclusion.
Sure, go ahead.
After going and citing all the federal laws and rules that were broken in submission of that document, such as knowingly failing to correct a false statement, knowingly offering evidence the attorney knows is false, knowingly disobeying an obligation under the rules of court, making false statements of material fact or law. It goes on to this litany of things, right? So I'm not going to read them all because it's really a long list. He says, in addition to the alleged violations of the rules of professional conduct, there is ample evidence in the public sphere to believe that the government attorneys violated Rule 13 of this court's rules of procedures when they failed to disclose the true origins of the Steele dossier, that the Steele dossier had not actually been verified, that the Democratic National Committee funded the Steele dossier, that the Steele dossier, that Christopher Steele had an election day deadline, and that multiple attorneys, agents, and government employees deemed the Steele dossier unreliable before the Carter Page FISA application was even filed. You still with me?
Yes, I'm here. We
okay.
typically mute ourselves when guests are
okay.
taking the floor.
Right,
Keep
because I heard
continue.
That
No.
sounded like we got disconnected.
Yeah, no, we're good.
Well, okay, let's finish this up. Without the release of the requested records, the public is left with no way of knowing whether these violations actually occurred, and continued public speculation can only serve to harm the integrity of this court and less confidence in the FISA application process. In the alternative, disclosure of attorney misconduct and this court's actions to protect the FISA process and the public from further abuse of the FISA process could actually increase the public's confidence in this court and protect the integrity of the legal profession. Conclusion: for the foregoing reasons, the movants respectfully request this court to make public: 1. Any orders, opinions, decisions, sanctions, or other records related to any investigation or finding related to this matter. And there you have it. The house of cards is coming crashing down on the deep state. And Comey, Clapper, the crapper, who lied to the American public,
Brennan.
lied to the Congress.
Who's that? And Brennan. Yeah. And who's the Elmer Fudd-looking character? I forget. Is that Clapper? The Elmer Fudd-looking character?
Clapper, yeah.
And
Clapper,
Comey, Clapper, Brennan. They all seem to have been caught with up to some sort of mischief. That's for sure.
Yes,
so.
but you know who put them up to it?
Hillary
It's all gonna
Clinton.
Go back. No,
Obama.
Actually, Barack Obama.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Barack Obama. He got all of his underlings to coordinate the outing, right? They call it unmasking, the unmasking of individuals. 300 people, and prior to that, I think that only 6 others had ever been unmasked before that. Now, Sally Yates and Susan Rice in the United Nations, they are part of this plot, and they were working hand in glove with British intelligence to derail Donald Trump in order to make us get on the New World Order bandwagon and the climate, Paris Climate Accords and the TPP. Boy, we really bailed out of all those things just in time, and I'm as happy as a lark, you know.
It was interesting to note Trump in his first, what he did, the first action that he took as president was to nullify the TPP. So that's interesting to reflect upon and note. But, it's interesting where this is all going to lead. I think the Democrats, as it were, Comey and this whole gang of, I think there's like 13 individuals that have been put together basically in the same group. That they're who knows how far it could go and how many people might end up finding themselves in some pretty serious hot water. But also because of the way the Democrats they've overplayed their hand, is what it seems to me. Yeah. And I'm sure many observers do. They've had their chance. They've had their turn. Doesn't look like much has materialized. And now it's Trump's, it's things have turned back to Trump for him. And, he's going to have his say in things and let his case and evidence be presented and heard. So things could definitely get quite interesting. But we're pretty much all out of time here as it is, Robert, having run the course, as it were. Now, we are going to shift things back to the after show, head off to one of the local resident drinking watering holes, the scurvy dog, the howling wolf, or the mossy wench. It's really up to you. I'm not sure if either of those names.
I like the green dragon.
Well, the green dragon. I think you've heard of the green dragon. Oh, yes.
Yeah, of course.
We can do that
one. The
Green
Dragon Society was part of the Druid Rebellion against the king way back when, and that's how John Quincy Adams, and Thomas Paine wound up in the United States.
I read a book dealing with the Spear of Destiny, actually, Trevor Ravenscroft. The sequel wasn't so great, but I thought the first one was pretty decent. And he did mention the Green Dragon Society in that book. I think its ties, in fact, lead all the way over to Japan, if I'm not mistaken. There's
I don't know if it's the same society, but the Green Dragon Society figures very, very strongly in the Nazi mystique, with Albert Hoffer.
Yes.
Albert Haushofer was Hitler's mentor, teacher, developer, and he had been a very, very deeply involved occultist in Japanese ways, and that's how he was a member of the Green Dragon Society in Japan and
Even
learned all of these
uh-huh.
mystical powers from. Yeah.
Well, even Tibet, from what I recall. But it's interesting. Speaking of the Green Dragon, I just, as we're discussing this matter, happened to see a picture of Robin Hood pop up on the screen here. So there's, that's an interesting tie-in, and the whole synchronicity to things there as well too. But big shout out, word of thanks, of course, to everyone who dropped by here this go round. Svetlana, of course, from out of Alberta, who we had on just a couple of weeks ago. Great show with her, hoping, along with Nori Love, who was present and making herself known during the start of things here, at least. Both of them would be great to have them back. Yeah. So she's she's a really wonderful person.
Follow each other on Facebook. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Joey Boomer, Vinny from Brooklyn, Rainbow Lightning Woman. I guess. Okay. I think I know who that might be, actually. I think her name is Lisa Marie, if I'm not mistaken, off of Facebook. So we're actually working on.
She's a Facebook friend.
Oh, do you know her as well, too, then?
Yeah, a lot of the people you mentioned are friends that I notified before the show on Facebook.
Okay, so in some cases, I think, too, we happen to be sort of moving in the same social media circles to some extent.
Makes sense.
Sure. And let's see, let's see. Well, what we should do actually is bring Vinny into the conversation here up in the crow's nest and see if he can maybe draw to our attention if there's anyone else he feels we've missed out on. Vinny, there's a whole long laundry list of people and personalities who did drop by and help to make this week's conversation episode 145 with Manhattan, New York resident Robert Morningstar, a general success, I would say. So anyone that we've failed to mention, Vinny?
I think that I'm not sure if we did mention TRF2, but if not, hail and welcome. Thanks for all the discourse in the chat here. Hey, let me throw in something fun, because you mentioned something, Robert, about JFK predicting his own murder. I believe RFK did as well, when he pulled the necktie off of Fang Eugene Caesar.
That's
so
right.
Maybe we'll discuss that after the show.
Sure.
Oh yeah. By the way, if you check out that link that I provided, that was one of the most important articles that I've ever published, and it's about the last acts of Robert F. Kennedy fighting for his life.
Cool. I'm so glad to hear somebody talk about that, man, because I think
it was and I've proven that it was Thane Caesar. He's the only person within radius.
Yes, exactly. Oh my goodness, yes. Wow.
You'll enjoy that article. Thanks, Vin.
Absolutely, brother. Thank you.
Vinny, are you able to actually add anything in real live time here to the live chat over on YouTube? I know you were kind of handicapped this last Tuesday, of course.
I was quadriplegic the other day, but I am a triathlete today.
Okay. Well, if you can manage to do that, add those links, because
these guys.
The way I'm set up here, just having to work off of the two separate computers, keep the show in place here and streaming along without too many problems. So just to remind listeners as well, too, that you can follow up on Robert's story, his research, and even some of the shows that he does. You've got your own regular, you appear with Richard Hoagland, of course. The name of the show is something after midnight.
The other side of midnight.
That's right.
I was going to ask Vinny up in the crow's nest if he saw any icebergs. The joke, because if you go to Richard Hoagland's website, there's a show that I did on the Titanic with my friends Tim Saunders and Andrew Curry. And brother, I'm going to tell you something that's going to knock you out.
Sure, brother.
The Titanic did not sink.
It was sunk, right?
It was switched.
They scuttled the sister ship, the Olympic, to collect a vast sum of money in insurance. But we proved it on the night of April 7th on Richard Hoagland's show. Tim Saunders and I and Andrew Curry, we came up with our our each of us with our bundle of evidence, and between Tim and I, we prove beyond the shadow of a doubt that the ship that's lying on the bottom of the Atlantic for these 107 years now is without a doubt
The Olympic.
the Olympic. And the
Wow.
proof is the windows. We got
Ah,
pictures. The windows structure of the Olympic is what's on
they
the
always
bottom
give
of the sea.
themselves away, brother. They always give themselves away. Something always does.
And just like
Yeah.
Robert was talking about earlier, there is just an endless multitude of plays that they have in their book, the countless number of tricks up their sleeve, the powers that be, these shadowy players who operate at various levels, of course. And isn't it something, too, to note that so much that where we find people who are members of various intelligence networks also happen to be involved in fraternal orders, secret societies such as the Freemasons and other outfits and organizations as
Right.
well, Rosicrucians and you name it. As which, in fact, the Rosicrucian angle ties in quite prominently to the RFK assassination because of
Yes.
Sirhan's deep
said it.
fascination. So, yeah. Well, we'll talk about more of these matters and anything else that comes along here in the after show. And as well, let's not forget we're going to get into the moon a little bit too. There, let's remind listeners that there was a recent Fox News article that was put out, and it seems to be it's breaking news. It was a leak of sorts, apparently, discussing how there are plans to return to the moon within the next few years, and a whole number of different projects as well tied to that part of space up out there in the sky as we know it. So just any closing thoughts or comments? I know, once again, listeners, people who drop in and are following things here, can check out your links down in the show description area. UFO Digest, of course, is one of the main places they can contact you, and so on. You've yet to put together a Minds.com channel, though, too.
Right. I've been a little bit slack on that. I'm really looking forward to it. I just I bought 2 domains, and they're called Morningstar. I'm going to launch them later on this year. I did a whole series of shows, and I was using my favorite theme song for those shows was Jefferson's Starship, Blows Against the Empire, and the song called Starship, and it's got my vibe, and so I decided to launch something called the Morningstar.
That's fun.
Yeah, more science and science fiction and science fact and fantasy, imagination.
We'll have to keep our eyes out for that, of course, and look forward to seeing what comes of that project. Just before we wrap up here, let's remind listeners that we also had Carol Sloan drop by, Macarena maybe too, but you know how to pronounce her surname. Yeah, Macarena.
Make it Macarena.
Macarena.
Thank you for listening, Louise.
Yeah.
My love to your mother.
And she's your cousin, is she?
Yes, she is.
How about that? Interesting person competition. Not sure who that character is. Looks like he might have some relationship with AWOL Aaron as things stand. Someone who we're working on having drop by here, perhaps with one of our upcoming news segments, the first hour of what we put together each and every Tuesday night, of course. So I think outside Nethead too, and if there's anyone else that we did miss out in acknowledging, our apologies, of course. But hope to see you again next time, everybody. And don't forget to check out the news show that we do have coming up this Tuesday. I'll get you guys just to maybe mute yourselves for the time being as we do the outro here, and just remind listeners that you can always drop by patreon.com/WPRPN if you are interested in helping to support us a little more. PayPal donations, we got a few of those that happen to come our way from time to time. Pirate1Radio@protonmail.com is the email address you want to use for that, as well as minds.com. We have token donations that you're able to sometimes send our way. So we're very much open to, receiving those and then, of course, redistributing in accordance with the Robin Hood mandate and philosophy. Half of everything that does find its way into the community coffers. So we're heading off on out. I guess it sounds like the Green Dragon here is what Robert is hoping we can do here. So I think that's pretty much what is in the cards here and in the works for the three of us at least, and anyone else out there, of course, listening who would like to drop by. It's a pretty much an open door, an open house event. So everybody and anybody is pretty much welcome. Having said that, until we meet again out on the high digital seas, on behalf of Captain Long John Sinclair, Vinny from Brooklyn, and all the rest of the crew here aboard the Robin Hood, I'm your host as always, the show's Chief Communications Officer, Jfk Ryder. Tally-ho. Having carefully looked over each of our navigation panel instruments, checking every level, switch, dial, cable, knob, and pulley, by all accounts and indications, we indeed see it's time, once again, to drop anchor inside Mystic Bay, draw an end to yet another week of World Pirate Radio Live. Remember, if you're looking for a little more animated online action, keep in mind, we've likely got yet another great free-flowing Rogues Gallery after show coming up for the next hour in one of our more premium exclusive and remote digital underground online pirate hideaways. Also, if you yourself have a new, novel, intriguing, or otherwise underreported idea, unique individual, or pressing item in mind, be sure to either drop us a line directly over on WPRPN.com or fire us a quick email via pirateoneradio@gmail.com. We're always open to exploring fresh creative suggestions, intriguing guest ideas, cutting-edge discussion topics, and captivating themes. WPRPN.com network subdomain links are also now available. Great for artists, musicians, podcasters, bloggers, social media personalities, or pretty much just any old land lover looking to boost their online visibility, presence, and reach. Basic personal profile accounts can be launched for just $60 per year. Staking your claim now helps not only strengthen you and the network, we're also looking out for the little guy. That's right, folks. As much as half of all WPRPN's profits are redirected right back into the hands of the people who really need it most. Community charity. After all, we are the Robin Hood. You can further embark on your own personal pirate journey by either liking, sharing, commenting on, subscribing to, or just following us via virtually any mainstream social media platform, including Twitter, Facebook, Google+, or Minds.com. So don't forget to become engaged. Until we meet again out on the high digital seas, I'm your host as always, the ship's Chief Communications Officer, Jfk Ryder. Tally-ho.